Hello and welcome to the second tutorial in the first-person shooter video game inside of Unity. In this tutorial we're gonna build the controller that is going to control the player. So without wasting any time, the first thing we're gonna need is a game object that is gonna hold the first-person camera and the collision object. So for that we're gonna create a empty game object and we're gonna name it. And then we're gonna add in a component of a capsule collider. Okay, now we want to scale this capsule collider a little bit, something like this. And then we want to drag the camera and drop it inside the player. After you drop the camera, make sure to reset the position at 0. And then just move it up to where about the head of the player should be. Okay, that is our camera now. The next thing we want to do is add in a rigid body component. So we want to add in a rigid body, and then inside the rigid body we want to freeze the rotations. And everything, we're going to leave everything as is. And now let's jump into the scripts. So first we're going to create a script called Input Manager. And then we're going to create another script called the controller. So inside the Input Manager script, we're gonna need the inputs that we get from the keyboard and the inputs that we're gonna add in later for mobile devices. So the first thing we want to do is do hide in inspector, public float vertical axis, and then we're gonna copy that and name this horizontal. Now, as you might have guessed, these are the axes that we're gonna press with our keyboard. Next, we want to do a fixed update, and then we want to initialize these. So like we've done in other tutorials, we're gonna say vertical is equal to input dot get axis vertical. And then for the horizontal, want to do the same, input dot get axis dot horizontal. Okay, over into the controller script. First things first, we want to import this input manager script. So to do that, we want to say private input manager, and then to actually import it inside the script, we want to say start, and inside the start method we want to say input is equal to get component input manager. As simple as that. And now we can access the input manager variables. The next thing we want is a private variable of rigid body. Rigid body is the same as the input manager, so rigid body is equal to get component rigid body. And now we want public variables. So the very first variable we want to make changeable or editable is the speed of the character movement. So we want to say public float movement speed. We want to default this to 1. And now let's jump into the fixed update. So for the movement of our game object is fairly straightforward. We want to say rigid body dot add force. This is basically all we're going to use to move our character around. So this add force takes in a vector 3 for the direction and the amount of force that direction has. So for the direction, we want to get the position of our game object, which is simply transform, and we want the axis. So for moving forward, we want to say transform dot forward times. And now in here, we want to get the input manager dot vertical, which is the axis vertical, and then times the speed multiplier or the movement speed. And that is how you move the character forward. And now to move the character left or right is basically the same. rigid body.add force. And now instead of saying transform.forward, we're going to say transform.right times, open brackets, input manager dot horizontal times the movement speed. Hit save, and if everything is compiled correctly, we should be able to drop the input manager and the controller inside the player game object. And now if we hit play and we increase the movement speed, we should be able to walk. Okay, now let's make the mouse aim around. So for that, we're gonna go back to input manager. Once again, we want to hide an inspector. And this time we want two public float variables. So one is going to be for the x axis or the x value, and the other one is going to be the y value. Now to get the mouse movement, we want to be using a library which is called Unity Standard Assets cross-platform input. So this is what we're going to use. And now to initialize these x value and y value is almost the same as we initialize these. So we're going to say x value is equal to cross-platform input manager dot get axes. Now don't forget, the x value has to have the axis mouse y, and then the y value has to have the axis of the x. So y value is equal to cross input manager dot get axis mouse x. And now we're done with this. Go back to our controller, and now we want another input in here. We want the camera game object to be imported in here. So we're gonna say public this time, not private. Public camera object. Now, since this is a public variable, we don't need to import it in the start, so we can just straight away work with it. So to rotate the player around, we're gonna have to say transform.local rotation times equal quaternion dot Euler. Now this quaternion takes in three inputs, x, y, and z. Now as you might have guessed, the two of these variables have to be 0, and the one in the middle is going to be the one that we take in from the input manager. So in the middle one, we want to say input manager dot y value. And then for the x value, we want to rotate the camera object instead of the player game object. So we're gonna say camera game object dot transform dot local rotations times equal quaternion dot Euler. Then again, three inputs. So for the first input, you might have guessed we're gonna use the x value, but this time we want to say minus x input dot x value, and the other ones are going to be 0. Now we're going to hit save, and let's hit play. Okay, it works, but we have a error that we forgot to drag and drop the camera game object. Okay, so now we can move up and down. Okay, this is working perfectly. Now the next thing is to add a way of controlling the sensitivity of the mouse. So what we're gonna do is declare a range from 0.1 f to 5f. And then in here we're gonna call it public float mouse sensitivity. It's gonna be defaulted to 1, and then we're gonna use this into where we rotate the player. So in here we just want to say times mouse sensitivity, and then the same in here. Okay, so here is our sensitivity. We can go ahead and try it. Let's make it like really high. Okay, yeah, it works. Okay, the next thing we want to do is make this drag value change when we walk and jump. So what we're going to need for that is 3 float variables. The first one is going to be jump drag value. Second one is going to be walking or running drag value. And the last one is going to be idle drag. And now the way we're going to use the drag values is kind of simple, but since we're using the jump drag, we need a way to know if the player is grounded or not. So to know that, we're going to use this ready-made block of code. From there we just need this capsule collider. So let's import that. This is a private capsule collider, and then we're going to import the capsule collider, and now we have a way of knowing if the object is grounded or not. Okay, since now we have a grounded method, we're going to use that, and we're going to say rigid body dot drag value is equal to is grounded. Now in here we ask if it's grounded, and then we put a question mark, and now this is a if statement, but it's in a different way. So if the player is grounded, that means we're not jumping. But now we need a way of telling if we're running or if we're not running, basically idle. So we need another if statement, so open brackets, and now we're going to check into the input manager. So if input manager dot vertical is not equal to 0, or input manager dot horizontal is not equal to 0, then this means we are in running. So if this returns a true value, we want the drag to be the running drag. Else, that means we're in idle, and else, that means we're in jump. Let's hit save, and now we have 3 more variables in here. So the jump drag, we're going to default it to 2, the running drag to 5, and the idle drag to 20. Now we're going to hit play. Okay, now if you look at the drag up here, it's changing. Okay, so now I'm not running or jumping, and now we're in the idle. So if we run, the drag is going to be 5, and if we are in air, which we didn't implement yet, the drag must go to 3. Okay, now we need one last function, and that is the jump function. And now since the jump function is a one-time thing, we can't use this method. So instead we're going to use a public void, and we're just going to call it jump. And all that is going to do is tell the rigid body to add force into the direction transform dot up times the jump force. This jump force is going to be a public variable, which we're gonna default to 200. And now in the input manager, we're gonna need to import the controller. So we're gonna say private controller, and then we're gonna need to import it into the start method. So start controller is equal to get component controller, and then in the fixed update we want to check if we press the space key. So we're gonna ask if input dot get key down key code dot space, and then we just want to execute this function. So we want to say controller dot jump. Okay, let's try that. It works. So now we can jump. We can play around. And now, as you might have noticed, the player gets stuck as soon as it touches any other surface. To fix that, all we have to do is change the physics material to 0 friction. And then if you hit play, everything should work fine.